Welcome everyone to today's webinar with our guest Fabricio Corrales, Cybersecurity Chief at DIBCAC.
Good afternoon, and again, a warm welcome from Boston, winners of the 18th NBA title last night. But more importantly, welcome to today's webinar on understanding three critical topics: how DIBCAC, the DoD's top cybersecurity compliance division, assesses the defense industrial base organizations for DFARS 72 compliance, the role DIBCAC plays in CMMC Level 2 JSVA assessments, and finally, how DIBCAC determines FedRAMP equivalency for cloud services used to store and process CUI. This webinar is extremely timely. First, DFARS 7012 assessments are ongoing because it is the regulation currently in force. Second, CMMC joint surveillance voluntary assessments are also underway, and with CMMC just months away from being the law, understanding how compliance will be assessed is crucial. And third, a significant majority of DIB contractors use or will use cloud services to store and share CUI in order to be compliant. And those cloud services must either have an ATO, an authorization to operate, or be FedRAMP Moderate equivalent. This is a critical requirement in DFARS 7012 and CMMC. However, there was for a long time ambiguity in determining what exactly FedRAMP equivalency meant. That ambiguity now has been clarified by the Department of Defense's CIO's office in its December memo, and DIBCAC has now clear rules to determine whether a cloud service is equivalent or not. So we will delve into each of these highly important topics with perhaps the top expert and authority in the field, Mr. Fabricio Corrales, who's Chief of Business Operations at DIBCAC, which is the DoD's top Cybersecurity Assessment Division. Mr. Corrales oversees all administrative functions in support of DIBCAC's cybersecurity assessments, including DFARS 7012, CMMC JSVs, and C3PAO assessments, and finally also led the first assessments to determine FedRAMP equivalency. He also serves as DIBCAC's CMMC liaison to the DoD CIO's CMMC Program Management Office. Previously, Mr. Corrales, an Air Force veteran, served as DCMA's Cybersecurity Compliance Chief. He has personally served as a DIBCAC lead assessor for DFARS and FedRAMP equivalency, and thus brings unmatched expertise to address the topics of our webinar. Warm welcome to you, Fabricio.
Thanks, Sanjeev. I'm excited to be here today.
A lot of people are excited to hear from you. So let's start off by briefly telling us, what is DIBCAC and your role within the organization?
Absolutely. So the DIBCAC, it's a mouthful, so just prepare everybody. But it's a Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center. We are actually part of the Defense Contract Management Agency, who is basically the entity within the department that oversees a lot of our contracts in the Defense Industrial Base. DIBCAC was stood up back in 2019 as part of an initial pilot where Mr. John Ellis, who was the software director at the time, felt like we needed to start looking into compliance for DFARS 7012 requirements. So over time we have grown. Started with probably about 19 people, and then we have grown to over 100 at this point, and hope to grow over the next few years as well. But me personally, I currently have, I'm a group chief, so, it's kind of a government term for somebody who's in charge of other people. I oversee a group of over 60 assessors and 6 supervisors. As you mentioned, I was also the business operations chief, where I used to manage a lot of the administrative support functions that, we need in DIBCAC to make sure that we're able to execute our mission. I often, my current position, I engage with a lot of assessors, a lot of DIB partners, and then we try to do a lot of education similar to this, webinar that you guys put together today. I've been in the cybersecurity field and compliance for over 12 years. This is probably a little about my background that I bring over to this position.
Right. Well, the DoD considers failure to protect CUI using the 871, 110 controls or entities that have CUI a material breach of contract. And as you mentioned, DIBCAC was started in 2019 to conduct assessments to determine if contractors are meeting their contractual obligations. And as we understand it, you conduct two types of assessments, DIBCAC medium and high. Can you explain what are the differences between these assessments to the audience?
Absolutely. And let me preface that by saying that, the goal of the DIBCAC is not to, get anybody in trouble and then just report who's not compliant. Ultimately, what we want to do is we want to ensure that CUI is protected and also that intellectual property for defense contracts is also being properly secure, which at times, ends up crossing into that, controlled classified information realm. So ultimately, our goal is to make sure that everybody brings up, their systems up to speed and are able to protect the data. As you mentioned, the DoD CIO and ANS defined ultimately three types of assessment in the DFARS 2204-7020, I think it is, where, we have the high confidence assessments. You also have a medium assessment and a basic assessment. Now, basic assessments is not something that DIBCAC performs. It's usually a self-assessment of the contractor's information system. Everybody who has the 712 clause and the 7020 is required to do a self-assessment. But here at DIBCAC, our main focus, as you mentioned, is NIST SP 100-171 high and medium assessments. The way we do our assessments is we run the assessments against the DFARS 7 and 12, using the security requirements outlined in NIST SP 100-171, and then leveraging the assessment procedures on the NIST SP 100-171 alpha. For high assessments, your typical assessment will require a review of documentation, starting with the system security plan for a company, then any kind of supporting evidence or documents, artifacts. We also do a verification and validation where we do a over-the-shoulder review. We do not touch your systems, but we do require that the DIB partner has somebody available on their scenes to walk us through their system and explain to us how they implement the security requirements. And then based on that, we score the requirements using the assessment methodology. But that is specifically for the high assessments. Now, there is another type of assessment, which is the medium. We don't do this as much. The main focus of DIBCAC is usually on the high assessments. However, occasionally, based on DIB availability, that perhaps the days didn't work out or whatnot, we're able to perform a medium assessment. Now, the medium assessment ends up resulting in a medium confidence, assessment results. And what it entails is mainly a review of the system security plan and any kind of supporting documentation that you may provide as a DIB contractor to support your system security plan. There is not interviews. There is no over-the-shoulder validation. It's strictly a review of the system security plan. Now, a lot of folks will think that, perhaps, doing a medium assessment may be better than doing a high. The problem with the medium assessments is that they don't necessarily paint a very good picture of your security posture, as we're only reviewing it based on your system security plan. So if your system security plan is very well documented, you're probably going to do very well. But if it's not, even if you're implementing some of those requirements, you may not do as well. So we try to, work with the contractors to execute mostly high assessments, because it allows us to do that interview phase, that demonstration phase, to be able to get a better picture of what your system looks like.
So you spoke about the system security plan, which is a critical document to demonstrate how the security and compliance aspects have been implemented by a DIB company. Could you describe to us, what constitutes a good versus an insufficient system security plan document and other evidence that you review for your DIBCAC medium and high? In particular, many in our audience aren't familiar with what's an intuitive feel to them of, what's good. So could you provide some high-level guidance to the companies to self-determine whether they feel they're ready for a successful 800-171 assessment with DIBCAC? How would they find out for themselves?
Absolutely. So the main objective of the system security plan is document how an organization plans to meet and implement the system cybersecurity requirements. In the case of, cyber assessment support in the 7012, we know that system security plan has to outline the requirements specified in NIST 171. Now, what we try to remind folks is that the system security plan is not one of those documents that you draft at one time. You put it on the shelf, you dust it off, you pull it out when it's time for assessment. We wanted to look at the SSP not as a separate document, but as part of your enterprise, as part of your information systems. It's intended to be a blueprint of how you're going to document your system boundaries, system control implementation. And I like to look at it as a living document. As the system evolves, as the system changes, as there are new threats and there are new mitigations that come out because technology advances faster than we can think, you want to make sure that system security plan is updated. Ultimately, I don't want folks to think that system security plan, we're just going to draft it for DIBCAC. You really want to have it as that key piece of evidence within your system, as that blueprint that breaks down how you're going to protect your system. Anybody who is going to be managing your system should be able to refer to the system security plan if they don't understand something, and understand what the system entails, the type of information within the system, and then how are we protecting that information. So the system security plan is a critical piece of evidence, but it's also a critical piece of the governance of the organization as well.
And so you mentioned a couple of key things over here. One, I think that many people will think of the SSP as a one and done thing. And you have emphasized that this is a living document. And even after you've passed the assessment, I presume what you're saying is keep updating it. And then again, under CMMC and again with DFARS, you do it, but then you got to keep updating it in subsequent periods so that when the next assessment comes, you're ready. Is that, again, what you're saying, or am I misrepresenting anything?
No, that is correct. Like I said, it's not a one and done. You want to maintain the system security plan updated. In the federal space, we use system security plans, based off of the NIST 153 and NIST 137. But, that is because we have to get our systems authorized. For defense contractors, I will say you want to have that SSP and update it as needed, as the system evolves, as changes are made, because you want to refer to it. Whether DIBCAC is there looking at your SSP or not, you want to make sure that it's updated and that it accurately reflects how you're protecting your information in your systems.
And I know it's not a particularly great question, but, just general level of guidance, what indicates that SSP is at least somewhat thorough or not? I mean, I know that that number of pages is not a great indication, but could you give some sense that, is it a 2-page document, or, how would you kind of give a feel to the DIB?
So companies can choose whatever format they would like to for their system security plan. However, NIST has been gracious enough to provide a template out there. I think it's the NIST 118, and they also provide templates for CUI system security plans. As I mentioned earlier, the key thing is to make sure that the system is reflected in the system security plan. You want to ensure that boundaries are defined, that the types of information you're trying to protect are defined, that there are key stakeholders that endorse the system security plan, and that also it reflects how you implement technical security requirements and policy-specific requirements in order to protect your data. So it's like I said, it's a critical document, and it's kind of at the center of how we're going to start protecting information from an organizational perspective. So like I said, it's a blueprint, and it should be kept up to date as much as possible.
So Fabricio, moving on, based on your experience conducting what I believe are probably hundreds of these assessments, what are the top CUI security and compliance challenges organizations face during a NIST 800-171 DFARS assessment?
So there has been a different flux depending on the type of companies that we are assessing. When we first started the DIBCAC pilot, we were looking at big companies, and they had a very specific way of doing things, and it seems like things were tracking fairly well. However, as we start going down the supply chain, the smaller contractors, we're finding out that having stakeholder support can be challenging for some of the smaller defense contractors, especially if you're a company that maybe has 10 employees. You happen to have CUI because you have to provide a specific product to the Department of Defense that supports some type of critical program. But maybe you don't have a staff of 50 people in the IT department to be able to protect your information. So being able to ensure that stakeholders and leadership engagement can be challenging for those smaller companies, because at the end of the day, they have to decide, is it really worth it? It's not. It's a risk-based decision that contractors have to make, and ultimately, ideally, they want to protect that information, but there will be a cost associated with that more than likely, because protecting data and implementing the security requirements is not free. It's not easy. You have to have the expertise. You have to know what you're doing. So the biggest challenge, I will say, the companies face is being able to balance the risk mitigation and understanding what is it that we're willing to do, what is it that we can implement, how can we implement these requirements, and to what level, based on the work that is being done by the department or for the department. Additionally, the department hasn't really been very good about labeling CUI, so a lot of times companies don't really understand if they have CUI or not. So that is a big challenge that we have identified previously to DoD leadership. I'm sure there's, they're working on something to help out. There is a CUI marking guide that came out. So hopefully, that will help those things. But, knowing what data is, what types of data that you have, where data comes, where data goes is very critical. And I think those are kind of some of the biggest challenges we've seen up to date.
I think, again, you mentioned something about smaller contractors, and many small contractors, and we work with a lot of them, believe that DIBCAC only assesses large contractors, which was certainly true at the beginning. But is it correct that you only assess larger contractors, and if you're a small contractor, don't expect a DIBCAC assessment?
No, that's not correct at all. At the beginning, like I said, back in 2019, it made sense during the DIBCAC pilot to assess the big companies. Part of the reason was because these assessments were not mandatory. At that time, the assessment was voluntary. So in order to kind of start testing the assessment methodology and seeing how these assessments were going to happen, then we tried to work with big contractors at the time, some of the big primes. I think we conducted about 16 assessments as part of the pilot. And part of that was to kind of start getting the word out there that we're going to start doing assessments. Well, we also knew that more than likely most of these big contractors were going to do very well. Now, since then, we've had the 70/20 and the 70/19 clause that basically says that everybody has to comply and you can be assessed by DIBCAC at any time if you have those clauses in your contracts. And so up to this point, the majority of companies that we try to assess are probably in the medium to smaller side of companies. We don't focus as much on the bigs, mostly because, we know that the challenge is really when you start getting to those smaller big contractors and suppliers. And we also, try to assess companies that are supporting certain critical programs and technologies within the department. So there's not a specific size of a company, but I will say that most assessments, the vast majority of recurring assessments that we execute are probably in the medium to small size contractors. And that has, kind of shifted the way that we try to focus our efforts, because we're seeing the value of being able to get to those smart contractors and suppliers and start hitting down a little further into the supply chain.
Yeah, that's a very critical and a new piece of information where, DIBCAC's focus now being on small and medium contractors was, I think, something that wasn't, broadly understood. So may I ask you, tell us a little bit about the kind of the process. So you're a small company or a medium company. How do they get informed that they're going to be assessed? How does that process of assessment work? Tell us what the process looks like from the perspective of a small and medium company.
Absolutely. The process itself from a standardization perspective is basically the same for all companies. Once you're identified as possible, a company that should probably undergo assessment based on DoD priorities or programs that you may be supporting, you normally get added to our schedule. We will send a notification to your company leadership, company POCs that we have for the government, as well as your contracting officers, letting them know that we plan on doing an assessment on a specific type of date, on a specific date. There may be some back and forth if the date doesn't work for you at first. But then, we basically send a bunch of enclosures, a bunch of documentation that kind of speaks to the assessment. At that time, also an assessment lead would be assigned. And the role of that assessment lead is to be the point person for coordination and also the execution of the assessment. Prior to the assessment itself, that assessment lead will probably be reaching out to schedule what we call a scoping call to kind of understand a little more about your environment and then kind of understand, if you have multiple sites, if those multiple sites ran by the same network, or do you have separate networks? All those things are things that we have to consider from a planning perspective to whether or not we might have to go to multiple sites or not. There have been instances where we may have to do a hybrid because maybe the company is smaller, so they can't host as many assessors on site. But we try to do it on site as much as possible. We will be the assessment lead and the assessment team are going to ask for documentation up front, like your system security plan, trying to get understanding of your case codes and all the case codes that are covered by the system security plan. And then once we have all that information, we do the scoping, we will provide a tentative schedule of what the day-to-day will look like during the week of the assessment. Normally, we will start the day by doing an in-brief. We will talk to the company, try to understand what their environment operation looks like, what is it that they do for the government. And then we will probably proceed to start reviewing documentation and, possibly if the time allows, we might start doing interviews and demonstrations the first day of the assessment. But the process itself is the same across the board for all companies. And, we have a very standard process that we've tested over the last few years.
Interesting. And how long do these sort of the medium assessments typically last?
Did you say the medium assessments or the high assessments?
Yeah.
Which one?
The high, sorry.
For the high assessments, we give ourselves about 5 days. So typically what will happen is the assessment leader, the assessment team will meet with the company on Monday, to start doing the in-briefs, getting to know each other and whatnot. And then we break down the day based on, specific areas that we may be assessing. That is why we try to provide you a schedule up front. So that way, if you have a technical meet that needs to be available for a specific session, you know when they're going to be needed. So that way we don't take them away from their day-to-day job the entire week. And then we, most of the time, we don't really use up all 5 days. Most of the time, we probably finish in about 4 days. But we always have that extra day just in case there's anything that, we weren't able to review or observe. And then we might have to do so go back.
Interesting. And how about the medium assessments? How long does that process take? And just could you, again, for the sake of completeness, provide some guidance on that as well?
Absolutely. So for medium assessments, they're not as intrusive. They're not as invasive. Like I said before, it's basically a review of the system security plan and then the kind of supporting artifacts you may provide with the system security plan. So just kind of policies and procedures. That assessment itself, if you have a full group of assessors, will probably take us less than a couple hours because assessors will focus on the way that they start looking at the system security plan is they look at your system boundary, types of information, and then they start going down to the specific families that they may be assigned to assess. So the assessor may not be looking at the entire system security plan. They may be just looking at the general information area and then start digging down into some of the more specific areas for them to assess. So a couple hours, I will say one morning, if you provide a system security plan, we'll schedule we may schedule a debrief just to kind of let you know what is it that we're going to do. And then we'll provide an outbrief probably the next day just to let you know how you did.
Fabricio, tell us, what is a JSV assessment and what role does DIBCAC play in a JSV assessment versus the C3PAO?
Absolutely. So the Joint Surveillance Program, JSV, and the assessments that are part of the Joint Surveillance Program are ultimately a partnership between the DoD and industry to allow the better understanding of the cyber risk within the defense industrial base. They are voluntary assessments, so a deep contractor can sign up for an assessment. The only requirement we have is that you must have an active contract with the DoD for us to be able to assess you. Otherwise, we will not have authority to execute the assessment. Ultimately, the JSV assessment will be conducted as a majority by a CMMC third-party assessment organization, or C3PAO, and the DIBCAC. So we work together to execute the assessment. It allows for farther reach of our limited resources because then we know we're partnering with a third-party assessment organization to execute the assessment. And then it will allow those C3PAOs that are kind of getting into the program to kind of understand how the process works and how they're going to be assessing once CMMC goes live. From a DIBCAC perspective, we treat what you will get as a defense contractor is you will get credit for an NIST 171 high assessment. So in our eyes, ultimately it is a high assessment and you will end up getting a high assessment score in Spurs. For the CMMC third-party assessment organization, they will be treating it as a CMMC level 2 assessment. And they will probably, I think the intent is that once the rule is finalized, if you get a 110, I think the intent is for you to, that will kind of translate into a CMMC level 2 assessment. As far as I know, that's kind of the plan that, right now, but, a lot of things could change, real big can still go out to the hoops. But that's the intent. It's like a 2-for-1. You'll be getting a CMMC assessment and also an NIST 171 assessment. So that's kind of the summarized version of what those are.
So just again to clarify over here, whether it's a DFARS 7012 assessment or a CMMC assessment, the controls that are being assessed are exactly the same. They're the 110 controls of NIST 800-171. And the DFARS 7012 assessment assesses them in your high assessments, and CMMC is exactly the same, except that the C3PAO is assessing the DIBCAC, supervised. Is that a fair way to categorize?
Yeah, I mean, other times, especially if it's a C3PAO, there might be more engagement from the DIBCAC, but we try to let the CMMC 3PAOs work through their process, do their interviews, do their demos. If there's anything that perhaps we didn't understand, we didn't see, DIBCAC personnel will ask the question. But the intent of it is to allow the C3PAOs to conduct the assessment. We're not necessarily there to provide any kind of a surveillance of the C3PAO because that's not the intent. The intent is to kind of start allowing folks to transition to that mentality of CMMC. We'll still executing those NIST 171 assessments.
So, again, it sometimes doesn't hurt to repeat, but can you describe, if you were a SMB or a defense contractor of any size, what are the benefits to you to volunteer for a CMMC joint surveillance assessment? Now, why should you choose to get one versus not?
So again, it will be a company decision. However, one of the good things about it is that If you sign up for a CMMC or for a joint surveillance assessment, you may not have to wait for DIBCAC to identify you as a critical supplier or contractor. You will sign up for a joint surveillance assessment. And you will pick your own C3PAO. You will work with them to get on the schedule. I believe the Cyber AD is usually engaging with industry, and they provide us a list of companies that want to get a joint surveillance assessment schedule. We'll try to fit you in within the next, 90 to 120 days out, if possible. And, it will allow you to kind of see what things are going to look like when CMMC is effective, but also it allows you to see what your current security posture is of your organization. There's not really a penalty for it. If you don't do very well, then you know what areas you're going to have to work on getting up to speed so that, you don't have any issues come CMMC. And then, from a DIBCAC perspective, we will identify the security requirements that you maybe didn't do as well, so that you can, execute a plan of action to correct those deficiencies. But there is not really a penalty. If anything, I think the benefit is that you get to see what things will look like come CMMC, while still getting credit for NIST M171 high assessment.
Fabricio, you mentioned SPRS database, and again, many are familiar with it, and the SPRS score. Could you elaborate a little bit about, you go through this JSVA or a DIBCAC medium or high assessment, or particularly a high assessment. What is this SPRS score, and what's inputted into this database, and why does this score matter?
So the SPRS, and I believe it stands for a Supplier Performance Risk System. It is the system that DoD, CAO, as well as ANS have determined. It is the system of record for assessment scores. If you have a requirement to, execute or implement NIST SPI 171 requirements because of 7012 clause in your contract, you will document your self-assessment in SPRS. Now, from a DIBCAC perspective, when you do your self-assessment, that will be considered a basic assessment. So, you will have different options that we have here at DIBCAC. But when we execute an assessment, whether it is a medium assessment or a high assessment, we will enter the scores in the same system. So that would be the system of record and repository, the official scores for all defense contractors.
Interesting. So when you conduct the assessment, you assign a score, you enter it into the database, and now you also said earlier that likely that if you have a 110 score on a JSV assessment, then you would be basically getting level 2 CMMC certification.
And that is the intent as of right now, as far as I know, we will be correct.
My final question on the JSV assessments and CMMC here. What role does DIBCAC anticipate playing in future CMMC assessments?
Regarding the draft rule, which I think is in the final stages of being adjudicated, now, I can't really comment specifically on what is that DIBCAC is going to do. It is expected that DIBCAC may be performing CMMC level 3 assessment on C3PO assessments, but it all is, at this point, it will be based on the draft. Come final rule and come the rule being published, and we'll know for sure what our mission is going to look like. We cannot have an idea, but we can't really speak much on it until the rule is final.
But what you can probably speak about is the role that you play in what are called C3PAO assessments. As we understood it, no C3PO can become a C3PO without DIBCAC assessing and authorizing that. So could you tell us a little bit about the role you play over there?
Yeah, so the DIBCAC has been tagged by DoD CAO to support the CMMC program in the form of assessing, C3POs. So what we do is we do an assessment of the environment of what a candidate C3PO is going to use to document their assessment results. Because once you start documenting and once you start, putting together all this assessment results, that data may become controlled classified information. So the department decided that we have to be able to ensure that the environment the C3POs are going to be using is secure. So they actually require C3POs to also meet the CMMC level 2 requirements. In the case of DIBCAC, we will assess the C3PO. We will conduct a CMMC Level 2 assessment. And then those scores are actually provided to, or the results of the assessment are actually provided to the CMMC Program Management Office, who will also pass that information over to the CyberAB. And I think from we tend to call them, especially if you're not currently a C3PO, but you're looking to be a C3PO, and we consider you're a candidate C3PO, you will become a C3PO once you get that final certification from the CyberAB.
Right. I have a question that is often asked, and I want to kind of interject that over here before we move to the next part of the questions. And this deals with the 110 controls. And as you know, that those controls that you're assessing are under 800-171 Rev 2. And the question often people ask is that as Rev 3 is finalized, is the requirement to meet Rev 2 going away or not? How would you provide guidance on that?
So as of right now, part of the new thing with Rev 3 is going to be the organization-defined parameters. That is where the department is going to have to tell you what the minimum acceptable requirements for some of these controls are going to be. I know that there is a working group right now, but it's going to take some time for the department to finalize ODPs. So there is a class deviation at this time that has been published by DoD that basically states that up until further notice, we will continue with the NIST SB 171 Rev 2 for the DIBCAC assessments, and I will foresee that all probably being the same for CMMC. CMMC uses a different nomenclature, but ultimately it's the same, controls. So I will expect that to be probably the same. Now, once DoD has moved forward with the ODPs and they have those defined, then I'm sure they will provide an update as to the exact implementation date for Rev 3 will be, and then when those assessments will switch over to Rev 3 as well.
So if I may paraphrase over here, as we understand it, and again, we saw the same, memo, currently and in the foreseeable future, you're going to continue with Rev 2. So organizations that are preparing should just focus on Rev 2. And as and when Rev 3 comes in, I would also expect there'll be adequate time given. It's not like, you're going to be asked to go switch over instantly.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, we can expect probably the department to provide those timelines in the future once ODPs are defined. But I think we're a little bit ways out from that.
So now we go and move to the third topic of this webinar, which is adding to this alphabet soup over here, FedRAMP. So there is a FedRAMP Moderate requirement, which says that basically if you store and share CUI, then you must, if you're using a cloud service provider, that cloud service provider must be FedRAMP baseline moderate equivalent. So can you tell us, to start with, what is the different ways in which entity that wants to meet DFARS and CMMC can become compliant with this FedRAMP requirement? Can they do it with an ATO or equivalence or both? And what are the differences? Again, many may not understand, and we'll go into details, but let's start with the very basic flow.
Absolutely. So in the DFARS Certificate 2204-7012, there is language that requires a defense contractor to use a FedRAMP authorized or equivalent cloud service provider when intending to process, store, transmit CUI using that cloud offering. Now, FedRAMP is the federal government program for standardization of cybersecurity assessments in order to move the department towards cloud, or not the department, but the entire federal government towards cloud. It basically promotes the adoption of cloud around this federal space. And then it is actually ran by the FedRAMP Program Management Office. They're the ones who host the site, the marketplace, all that stuff. From a DFARS perspective, there are two options for you to be able to be to meet the requirements. One is leveraging a cloud service provider who is authorized as moderate within the FedRAMP marketplace. So the marketplace will have a list of cloud offerings, And if your cloud offering is there and you procure one of those services, then you would meet compliance. Now, on the other hand, we have the equivalency part of the DFARS. Now, one of the challenges that we have ran over the longest time was trying to define what was equivalent. There was no really clear guidance, as the language in the DFARS is not very specific. It just basically says FedRAMP Moderate equivalent. However, back in December 2023, the DoD-CIO released a memorandum that further defines what that equivalency means and what those requirements for cloud service offerings and providers who do not have a FedRAMP ATO as to how they can become or be considered equivalent and still meet DFARS compliance.
So, as you shared, your DIB company looking to use a cloud service, you can check whether they have an ATO or they have established equivalents. You also mentioned that the DoD-CIO came out with a clear memo, which I know you're following, on what are the key criteria to be FedRAMP Moderate equivalent. So could you start by speaking to the basic fundamental key criteria laid out in this December memo by the DoD-CIO on what constitutes FedRAMP Moderate equivalence?
Absolutely. So the DoD-CIO memorandum kind of breaks down all the security requirements or the security compliance requirements and artifacts that are needed as part of the body of evidence when assessing a cloud service provider that is equivalent. It follows the same framework as the FedRAMP process for FedRAMP authorized cloud service providers, except for the fact that it doesn't require you as a cloud service offering or provider to have a federal sponsor that will issue an ATO. It breaks down the requirements such as having a system security plan, any kind of system security plan, supporting documentation, that you must implement all security requirements or security controls within the FedRAMP Moderate baseline, that there could not be any, currently at least, there could not be any class of actions and milestones that are open, so they will have to be completely closed. If you have any qualms, you can have operational qualms, which are like the kind of day-to-day scanning type class of actions, but you cannot have any open qualms for the specific security controls. You must also be assessed by a FedRAMP third-party assessment organization, have your supporting documentation such as a security assessment plan, security assessment report. You must also have a bank test that has to be done, I believe, yearly. So there's a lot of requirements that are very similar to what is asked of the FedRAMP authorized cloud service providers, but it allows for opening up the market to other solutions that perhaps don't have a federal sponsor that can grant them an ATO at this time.
So let's go break out this into small pieces over here. Let's start by, again, getting clear guidance. So suppose that DIB company goes to cloud service provider that says that they're equivalent. Can that cloud service provider be equivalent if they are self-assessing, or they must have been assessed and deemed to be equivalent by a FedRAMP 3PAO, certified 3PA? So could you clarify that as starting just?
Absolutely. So according to the DoD-CIO memorandum, the cloud service offering must leverage a FedRAMP recognized 3PAO. Part of the reason for that is because the FedRAMP 3PAOs go through a specific process to be able to be recognized and listed in the marketplace. They have been, for the most part, recognized as experts on this process, and the department is willing to accept assessment results from these 3PAOs. So it is very critical if you are trying to show equivalency compliance that, perhaps look at that FedRAMP marketplace and see what the recognized 3PAOs are, and then have one of those 3PAOs be the ones executing that assessment. Mostly because it's not the department doesn't trust others, but they know that they have the expertise and they have the experience to be able to provide those assessments, and they also know what they're looking at. So they can certainly be, it's not so much for the assessment itself, but also they can give you an idea of where you sit at from a compliance and cybersecurity control implementation standpoint.
Let's move to the next one, which is you mentioned in your opening remarks about the criteria that, okay, you got yourself assessed as a cloud service by a FedRAMP 3 PAO, and you provided, a certain body of evidence. So in order to meet FedRAMP Moderate equivalence, what are the 3 key items that this body of evidence must demonstrate? What I mean by that specifically is, what percentage of the controls for FedRAMP must the CSP pass, the cloud service provider pass? Second, are POAMs allowed? And third, what are the requirements for continuous monitoring? Let's go step by step over here. So let's start with this body of evidence and what percentage of controls must the cloud service provider pass?
Absolutely. Like I mentioned earlier, they must have 100% compliance with the security requirements according to, or the security controls in the FedRAMP Moderate baseline according to the memo. So you must be 100% compliance. You must meet all the controls at the time of providing the body of evidence to your client, and also the DIBCAC is going to be assessing. You must also make that available, showing that you are 100% compliance. So there cannot be any open POAMs that are related to security controls themselves. So the biggest thing is 100% compliance, and all those controls have to be implemented at this time. There may be some changes coming in the future, but as of right now, that is how the memo reads, and that is what we have to go by.
Okay. And would you speak to continuous monitoring?
Absolutely. So one of the requirements for if you're going for a FedRAMP ATO is that you have to have a continuous monitoring strategy. That continuous monitoring strategy breaks down how you're going to ensure that on a day-to-day basis, you're providing surveillance to your system, your cloud service offering, and what you're going to be selling to your customers. While the requirements in the memo is for, you have to do annual assessments, just like you would if you were a cloud service provider that is listed on the FedRAMP marketplace. But you must also do things a little more frequent, such as scanning. You must have things like database scans, web application scans. If you have infrastructure, those infrastructure scans have to be conducted. All those have to be conducted on a monthly basis. You also must have a pen test. There's several requirements that are listed on the memo, and a lot of those actually support your annual assessment, which is what we want to ensure. You want to ensure that your cloud service offering and your provider is ensuring that they align with those requirements, and they're providing you as a customer the right information, the right artifacts.
So for the audience that is joined over here, just posted a link to a blog that we have authored on how we went through this assessment, and it includes the DoD memo that Fabricio is referring to, and that outlines all the requirements as well, so in case people are interested. So next, moving on to the migration of the FedRAMP standards. As you are aware, they are migrated from Rev 4 to Rev 5. And so if there's an organization that wants to become FedRAMP Moderate equivalent, could you provide some guidance on what is the cutoff for the cloud service provider to be assessed on Rev 4 versus Rev 5?
Sure. So the FedRAMP Program Management Office has drafted a Rev 4 to Rev 5 guide that kind of spells out all the timelines of when cloud service provider must fully transition to Rev 5. The initial timeline was to identify Delta security controls and requirements back in September of last year. However, they understand that it is a heavy undertaking because you're having to, redraft all your documents, all your policies to align with the new Rev 5 baseline. So my understanding is that at the time of CSP having their annual assessment, they should probably be moving towards Rev 5 sometime towards the second half of 2024. So if you are a cloud service provider and you did your annual assessment on Rev 4 in November, come November this year when you do your annual assessment, you should be looking to do that with Rev 5. I think over time, what's going to happen is as you are doing your assessments against Rev 5, Over time, we're going to start fully transitioning to Rev 5 probably in the next 4 months or so.
Could a company that's in the audience asks you, Fabricio, could you rattle off a few things that are a checklist for me to determine if the cloud service that I am using is compliant or not? What would you offer them as 5 or 6 points on the checklist to determine compliance?
So, just as we mentioned before, there's 2 options. You either have a moderate baseline cloud service provider that's listed in the marketplace, or 2, they must follow the guidance on the DIBCAC memo. Now, there's not really a specific checklist. For DIBCAC, we use an internal checklist that we provide that we are assessing you for you to kind of provide the documents that you or documents that are part of the body of evidence. But nothing prevents the cloud service provider, cloud service offering of creating their own checklist and providing that to their customers. It always helps if you're able to map the body of evidence requirements to a specific file name. So let's say if you have a system security plan, if you identify what that system security plan is, it always helps speed up the process when it comes to assessing, because assessors are able to quickly point to the right document saying, okay, yes, you have that, you meet that requirement, and then move on to the next one. So, always start with the official guidance, which is the DIBCAC memo, and then broken down fairly easy. You could actually build an internal checklist if you like to, but that will be my starting point for everybody.
I think that's great guidance where basically you're saying, look at the memo, it lays out bullet by bullet what's the requirement, and you get from the cloud service provider, well, here's my assessment that was done by a 3PAL, and here's the document that satisfies bullet 1, bullet 2, bullet 3, and that's probably the best way to kind of meet that. So we are coming to the end over here, and I know you're a compliance expert, but a lot of us are getting wrapped around on this whole compliance topic. I know it's important. Oh, what about, what's your perspective on compliance versus real cybersecurity? What would be your guidance on that topic?
So from a compliance perspective, I believe compliance is essential for any organization's governance. Typically, compliance requires you to adhere to specific rules, regulations, laws, standards, and it is often driven by some type of legal requirement. Now, on the other hand, when you're talking about cybersecurity, cybersecurity itself encompasses a broader aspect of things. They basically starts getting into the practices and measures to protect the data in the organizational system. Cybersecurity requires a proactive approach, and you want to ensure that you're staying on top of all those practices, because you want to prevent the exploitation and compromise in your systems. Ultimately, the goal of cybersecurity is to mitigate the risks and bring them down to an acceptable level for the organization. Now, compliance itself can be a tool that is used to kind of measure where you're at with your cybersecurity practice implementation. So I think that there has to be a balance. Being compliant doesn't necessarily mean that you're protected, but at least it can be used as a tool to gauge where you stand and adequately mitigate risk.
Well, again, thank you so very much for providing us guidance on these 3 important topics. With that, we thank you again, Fabricio, for the role that you're playing and for joining us and providing us guidance on these 3 important topics. Appreciate it as always. Thanks very much, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.